The streets of Owerri were alive with noise that morning, but inside the grand gates of the Obiajulu household, a different kind of silence hung heavy. Chidinma, a young bride from a quiet village, stepped into her new home with trembling hands. Her heart beat fast as she looked around the mansion, its walls shining with wealth she had never imagined. Everything felt strange, almost too big for her small steps, yet she carried herself with quiet strength. She had promised herself that no matter what, she would prove to everyone that she could be a good wife. Her husband, Obiajulu, walked proudly beside her, but she noticed how his mother, Madam Ifeoma, watched her every move. The woman's sharp eyes followed Chidinma like a shadow, cold and calculating. Chidinma lowered her gaze, feeling the weight of judgment before a single word had been spoken. The other relatives whispered among themselves, some smiling politely, others already frowning, as though waiting for her to make a mistake. Chidinma remembered her own mother's words as she left the village. A good heart will always shine brighter than gold. She held on to that thought like a shield. Inside her, nervousness and determination wrestled with each other. She wanted this marriage to work, she wanted to build a life, even if she had to fight silently for her place. As she walked deeper into the mansion, she realized that this was not just a new home. It was a battlefield, and her courage would be tested from the very first day. The sun had barely risen when Madam Ifeoma's voice echoed through the wide halls of the mansion. Chidinma, tonight we will host 20 of the most important people in this city. It is your duty to cook for them. Let us see if you can handle it. Her words carried no warmth, only challenge, as if she wanted Chidinma to fail. Chidinma's heart sank, but she quickly forced a smile and bowed her head. Yes, Mama. Inside, fear churned in her stomach. 20 guests, business associates, family elders. This was not a simple village meal. It was a grand feast. Yet she told herself she could not back down. She wanted to make her mother proud, to make her husband proud, even if her in-laws only wanted to see her stumble. From that moment, the entire day belonged to the kitchen. Chidinma rolled up her sleeves and began. She chopped piles of onions until her eyes stung with tears, not just from the sharp smell but from the weight of the task before her. She pounded peppers in a heavy mortar, the sound echoing like a drumbeat through the kitchen. She grated, stirred, washed, and seasoned. The smell of fresh spices filled the air, blending with the steam rising from the pots. Her hands began to ache, blisters forming from the constant grinding and stirring. Still she did not stop. Sweat dripped down her forehead, soaking her wrapper, but she pushed through, humming softly to calm her racing heart. Whenever her body wanted to collapse, she remembered her mother's words. A woman's strength is not seen in how easy her road is, but in how bravely she walks it. By afternoon, the kitchen looked like a battlefield. Pots boiled on every stove, trays of meat roasted slowly, and bowls of vegetables waited to be served. Chidinma moved quickly, her bare feet pattering against the tiled floor, her fingers moving with skill learned from years of village cooking. She prepared egusi soup rich with melon seeds, pepper soup with tender goat meat, plates of jollof rice that glowed red with tomatoes, and pounded yam smooth enough to melt on the tongue. She roasted fish, fried plantains, and seasoned chicken with a touch of ginger that made the air fragrant. The servants watched her with wide eyes. None of them had expected this young village girl to carry such strength, such determination. Some even whispered among themselves, admiring her courage, but careful not to let Madam Ifeoma hear. As the evening sun began to set, Chidinma wiped her damp face with the back of her hand. She looked at the long tables filled with dishes she had prepared alone, her body trembling with exhaustion but her heart swelling with hope. She imagined the guests smiling, nodding, praising the food. She imagined her husband looking at her with pride. Though her hands were sore and her back ached, Chidinma allowed herself a small smile. Tonight could be the night she proved herself worthy of respect. Tonight could be the beginning of her place in his house. The evening air in Owerri was warm, and inside the Obiajulu mansion, the dining hall glowed like a palace. Golden lights flickered from tall candles, their soft flames dancing across polished glassware and shining plates. The long table was covered in white linen, lined with bowls of steaming soup, trays of roasted meat, and baskets of soft pounded yam. Every dish carried the scent of Chidinma's hard work, and the entire hall smelled rich and inviting. One by one, the guests arrived in their finest clothes. The men wore flowing agbadas embroidered with gold, their caps sitting proudly on their heads. The women came in glittering gowns and head wraps tied high, their jewelry catching the candlelight. Laughter filled the air as they greeted each other, sipping palm wine and trading stories about business and politics. The sound of their voices echoed like music through the wide room. Behind them, Chidinma stood quietly, her heart thudding in her chest. Her wrapper was plain, her face still glowing from the heat of the kitchen. She folded her hands tightly, praying in silence as the servants began to serve the food she had spent the entire day preparing. Every step of the servants felt like a step closer to her fate. The first bowls of soup were placed in front of the elders. A spoon was lifted, then another. Chidinma held her breath. The seconds felt longer than hours. But then a nod. Another nod. One elder leaned toward another and whispered, "The seasoning is perfect." A woman smiled softly, chewing the tender goat meat. Soon, quiet approval spread across the table. "This pepper soup is rich. The jollof tastes heavenly. Whoever cooked this meal knows the work of her hands." Chidinma's chest filled with relief so quickly that tears almost welled in her eyes. She wanted to fall to her knees and thank God, but she only pressed her hands harder together, hiding the tremble in her fingers. For the first time since stepping into this house, she felt she might belong, but not everyone shared that feeling. At the head of the table, Madame Ifeoma's face was tight with disapproval. Though her guests praised the food, she exchanged cold glances with her sisters-in-law. They did not clap. They did not smile. Instead, they sipped their wine stiffly, pretending not to hear the compliments. In their eyes, this was not a victory but an insult, that a simple village girl could win the admiration of their wealthy guests. Chidinma noticed those looks. Her joy dimmed slightly, but she tried to hold on to the little light she had found. She reminded herself that this night was not about them, it was about proving she was capable. Still, the sharpness in their eyes pierced her heart, warning her that something darker was waiting ahead. The hall was filled with laughter and praise, yet beneath the glow of the candles, an unspoken tension coiled like a snake. Chidinma smiled faintly as the guests enjoyed her food, unaware that her greatest test of the night was only about to begin. The guests had finally settled around the long table, their laughter still bubbling as they filled their plates with the food Chidinma had prepared. The dining hall was alive with voices, the clinking of glasses, and the soft glow of candlelight. For a moment it almost felt like peace. Chidinma, standing quietly at the corner of the room, hesitated. She had been on her feet since morning, sweating over every dish, and now, as she saw a small space at the far end of the table, she thought to herself, maybe I can sit there quietly, just to eat a little. She moved carefully, almost tiptoeing, not wanting to disturb anyone. Her heart beat quickly, her palms damp, but she told herself she had earned this tiny moment. She wasn't going to sit at the head, she wasn't going to draw attention, just a place at the end, to eat like a member of the family she had married into. But just as she began to pull out the chair, a voice sliced through the room like a knife. "Stop!" Everyone froze. All eyes turned to Madame Ifeoma, who sat at the head of the table, her back straight, her face sharp as glass. She pointed her finger at Chidinma, her voice dripping with venom. "You are not one of us. Do you hear me? You do not belong at this table. Go outside. Go and eat with the servants where you belong." The room went silent. The laughter died. The clinking of cutlery stopped mid-air. Chidinma's hand, still resting on the back of the chair, went cold. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt as though the floor had been ripped away from under her feet. Gasps spread across the hall. Some guests covered their mouths in shock, others exchanged uncomfortable glances, whispering quietly. But no one dared to speak against Madame Ifeoma's words. Her face burned as though fire was licking at her skin. Her eyes blurred, though she fought back the tears. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the ground, but she stood frozen, every eye stabbing her with silent judgment. The shame was heavier than anything she had carried all day, heavier than the pots, heavier than the blisters on her hands. Her husband, Obiajalu, shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. The silence from him cut deeper than Madame Ifeoma's cruelty. With trembling hands, Chidinma stepped back from the chair. She bowed her head, her lips pressed tight to keep from crying out. She turned slowly, each step toward the door echoing in her ears like thunder. Behind her, the guests sat stiffly, their appetites suddenly dulled. Some looked down at their plates, unable to meet her eyes. Others whispered, shocked by the harshness of the command. Chidinma walked out of the glowing hall into the dark corridor, her chest heavy with humiliation. The laughter and voices faded behind her, replaced only by the pounding of her heart. Tonight she had fed the whole house, but she had been denied even the smallest place at their table. The night air outside the mansion was cooler, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside Chidinma's chest. She walked slowly into the servants' quarters at the back, her steps heavy, her face pale. The cheerful noise from the dining hall still echoed faintly in the distance, laughter and clinking glasses reminding her of the place she had just been cast out of. A servant quickly pulled out a stool for her, his eyes full of pity. Chidinma forced a small nod of thanks and sat down. Before her, the same dishes she had cooked were placed on a tray: pepper soup, jollof rice, roasted fish. The aroma was the same, the taste would be the same, but now it all felt bitter. Each plate looked like a cruel reminder. She had given her sweat and love into this food, yet she was not considered worthy to share it at the family's table. She picked up a spoon with trembling fingers. Her throat was tight, but she forced herself to take a bite. The rice that had filled the hall with smiles now tasted like ashes on her tongue. Her eyes blurred with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting the servants around her to see her brokenness. She chewed slowly, swallowing pain along with the food. Her mother's voice returned to her mind, soft and gentle like the wind in her village. "My daughter, dignity is worth more than gold. No matter what they take from you, do not let them take your dignity." The words should have comforted her, but tonight they stung, because her dignity had been dragged in front of everyone and crushed beneath Madame Ifeoma's words. She clenched her fists under the table, trying to hold herself together. The servants sat quietly nearby, stealing glances at her. Some of them looked ashamed, as if they too had felt the sting of being treated as less. One young maid whispered, "Madam, you don't deserve this." But Chidinma only gave her a faint smile and shook her head, not trusting herself to speak without breaking. Every sound from the main hall made her heart ache more. Each burst of laughter reminded her that she was outside, unseen, unwanted. She thought of the blisters on her hands, the sweat that had poured down her back, the long hours of pounding, stirring and roasting. All that effort, yet this was her reward, eating in the shadows like she was nothing. For the first time since she entered the mansion, she allowed one tear to roll down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, ashamed even of her own sadness. But inside, her heart felt like glass shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces. That night, as she sat among the servants with her food, Chidinma realized something painful but true. This family had no intention of accepting her. She would have to fight for her place here, or else be broken by their cruelty. Chief Ikin sat near the middle of the long dining table, his heavy gold rings shining under the candlelight as he lifted a glass of palm wine to his lips. He was a man of influence, respected by politicians and feared by businessmen, yet tonight his sharp eyes were not on the deals being discussed or the laughter around him. They were on the young bride who had just been humiliated before everyone. From the moment he had entered the mansion that evening, Chief Ikin had been paying attention. He had arrived earlier than most, and when others were still greeting each other in the parlor, he had passed by the kitchen. There he had seen her, Chidinma, the bride with tired eyes and blistered hands, bending over steaming pots, her wrapper soaked with sweat, her movements quick and steady. He remembered the way she wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, whispering prayers under her breath as she stirred. That picture stayed with him. Later, when the food was served, he had tasted it carefully. The pepper soup had depth, the egusi carried the perfect balance of spice and flavor, the roasted fish was tender and seasoned with skill. This was not the work of a careless cook, it was the work of someone who poured her heart into feeding others. Chief Ikin had been impressed. And then, just as he was about to finish his first plate, the cruel words from Madame Ifeoma cut through the hall. He watched the young bride freeze, watched her humiliation spill across her face like spilled wine. He saw the way her husband lowered his head, silent. He saw the way the other women at the table smirked behind their wine glasses, satisfied at her pain. He had been in many homes, he had seen pride and wickedness, but tonight something in him stirred with anger. He glanced at the faces of the other guests. Some were uncomfortable, some pretended not to notice, but no one spoke. They all chose silence, as though cruelty was normal. Chief Ekin's jaw tightened. He was not a man who enjoyed conflict at the dinner table, but he was also not a man who could sit and watch injustice unfold before his very eyes. As he took another sip of palm wine, his gaze shifted toward the door where Chidinma had walked out moments earlier. His sharp eyes softened with something rare for him, respect. Respect for her strength, for the way she swallowed her pain without creating a scene, for the way she endured the cruelty with quiet dignity. Chief Ekin leaned back in his chair, letting the noise of the dinner continue around him, but in his mind, he was already planning his next move. He would not allow this night to end with silence. He would make sure every person in this hall remembered not the shame of a young bride, but the strength of a woman who deserved far better than the treatment she received. His eyes glimmered with a dangerous calm, anger for what he had seen, and respect for the woman who had borne it. The dinner had reached its peak. Glasses clinked, laughter echoed, and the guests were deep in conversation about politics, business and family matters. The rich aroma of Chidinma's cooking still lingered in the air, and the plates before the guests were almost empty. It should have been a night of joy and celebration, but beneath the surface, the air carried a strange heaviness, the kind that comes after cruelty has been committed but no one dares to speak of it. Chief Ekin had sat quietly all evening, his sharp eyes observing everything. He had listened to the laughter, the false compliments, the whispers between Madame Ifeoma and her sisters-in-law. But inside, his heart burned. He could not forget the image of the young bride walking out in silence, her head bowed after being ordered to eat with the servants. It replayed in his mind like a bitter echo. Finally, he placed his wine glass down on the table with a soft but firm sound that immediately drew attention. Then he stood. The room grew still, the conversations dying mid-sentence. Everyone knew Chief Ekin was not a man who rose without reason. His deep voice carried through the hall, steady and commanding. This feast has been extraordinary. Every dish tonight speaks of skill, patience, and love. I have eaten in many homes, but rarely have I tasted food so rich, so carefully made. It is the kind of cooking that deserves honor. The guests murmured in agreement, nodding their heads. Smiles spread, but they faded quickly as his tone shifted. Chief Ekin's gaze swept the table, sharp as a blade. And yet, I must ask, where is the woman who prepared all of this? Why is she not here with us at the table, sharing in the joy of her labor? A heavy silence dropped over the hall. Forks paused midair. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one wanted to meet his eyes. Chief Ekin's voice grew firmer, rising with controlled anger. Why does she sit outside, hidden among the servants, while we enjoy the work of her blistered hands? Tell me, is this the way you honor a wife in this house? Is this the pride of a family that calls itself wealthy and noble? Gasps rippled across the table. Guests looked at one another nervously, some lowering their eyes to their plates, others covering their mouths with their hands. Slowly, all eyes turned toward Madame Ifeoma at the head of the table. Her face stiffened. She opened her mouth but no words came. For the first time that evening, her confidence faltered. She stammered, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. She is new. She is not yet. But Chief Ekin cut across her, his voice like thunder. Not yet what? Not yet human enough to be treated with respect. Not yet wife enough to be seen as family. A woman who can cook a feast such as this is worthy of honor, not humiliation. The silence deepened, thick and uncomfortable. The guests stared, waiting, some nodding quietly in agreement, others too afraid to speak. Madame Ifeoma's face grew pale, the weight of shame pressing down on her as the room held its breath. The room was frozen after Chief Ikin's thunderous words. The air felt heavy, as though the very walls of the mansion were holding their breath. Every guest at the table stared, waiting to see what would happen next. Madame Ifeoma, usually the loudest voice in any gathering, sat stiffly, her lips trembling as her pride cracked in front of everyone. Chief Ikin did not sit down. His tall figure stood like a mountain, his eyes sharp, his tone filled with fire. A woman who can labor from sunrise to sunset, preparing a feast fit for kings, is not a servant. She is not a stranger. She is the very heart of this home. And yet you cast her out like she is nothing. He turned slowly, letting his gaze sweep across the table. Shame. True shame is not in being poor. It is in being cruel to the one who gives you honor. The hall echoed with his voice, and many guests nodded vigorously. One elder cleared his throat and said, "The chief speaks the truth. That young woman has a gift. How can such talent be hidden outside like she is unworthy?" Another guest, a wealthy woman in a shimmering head wrap, shook her head angrily. "I have eaten in this house many times, but never food so fine. To think the cook herself sits outside with the servants. This is disgraceful." Murmurs grew louder around the table. Some guests even pushed back their chairs and stood, their protest visible. They could not keep quiet any longer. What was meant to be a night of glory for Madame Ifeoma was quickly turning into a night of shame. At the head of the table, Madame Ifeoma's hands trembled against the linen cloth. Her face, once proud and stern, was drained of color. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. The smirk that had once played on her lips when Chidinma walked out had now disappeared, replaced by fear and humiliation. Her sisters-in-law shifted uncomfortably, whispering frantically, but they too had no defense. Chief Ikin leaned forward slightly, his voice now calm but cutting like a blade. "Do not forget, the guests here tonight are not blind. We saw her sweat, we tasted her work, and we witnessed her humiliation. You wanted to lower her, but instead you have lowered yourselves." Gasps followed his words. The truth in them was undeniable. Some guests clapped softly in agreement, others nodded with fierce approval. Madame Ifeoma lowered her gaze to her plate, her pride collapsing under the weight of public disgrace. In that moment, everyone in the hall understood what had happened. The plan to shame the young bride had backfired completely. Instead of being seen as weak, Chidinma was now the one everyone admired. And Madame Ifeoma, once so feared and respected, now sat cornered, her reputation crumbling before the very people she had tried so hard to impress. The night that was meant to display her power had instead stripped it away, leaving her pale, silent, and humiliated before all. Obiagelu sat at the table, his chest heavy as the voices of the guests filled the hall. Chief Ikin's words still echoed like thunder in his ears, and he could feel the shame pressing down on his family. He stared at his mother, Madame Ifeoma, whose proud face had turned pale under the weight of public rebuke. For a moment, he wished the ground would open and swallow him whole. But deeper than the shame was the war raging inside him. All his life, he had been taught to obey his mother, to defend her in every circumstance, to put her above all else. She was the pillar of the family, the one whose approval meant everything. Yet tonight, as he thought of his wife, the woman who had been insulted, shamed and cast out, his heart twisted painfully. He remembered how Chidinma had looked earlier in the evening. Her hands blistered, her wrapper damp with sweat, her face glowing with quiet determination as she labored in the kitchen. She had worked like no servant ever would, not for money, but for dignity, for love. And still, his mother had cut her down without mercy. His eyes flicked toward the doorway where Chidinma had disappeared. In his mind, he could see her sitting among the servants, forcing herself to swallow food through tears she tried to hide. That image pierced him deeper than any knife could. For the first time he saw her strength, not just in the cooking, but in the way she endured humiliation without breaking. His heart pounded as he rose slowly from his chair. The hall grew quiet again, all eyes turning toward him. He looked at his mother, then at the guests, and finally, his voice broke the silence. "This is my wife," he said, his tone firm, louder than he expected. His hands trembled slightly, but his words carried weight. And she will never again be treated as less. Not in this house. Not anywhere. Gasps rippled through the hall. Some guests nodded in approval, others stared wide-eyed in shock. Madame Ifeoma's lips parted, her face tightening with disbelief. For the first time in his life, her son had spoken against her, and he had done it in front of everyone. Obiagelu took a deep breath and continued, his voice steady now. Yes, you are my mother and I honor you, but she is my wife and she is my family too. If you cannot respect her, then you do not respect me. The words hung in the air like fire. Silence stretched across the hall, broken only by the sound of someone's chair creaking as they shifted uncomfortably. Obiagelu sank back into his seat, his heart still racing, but for the first time he felt free. He had chosen not only loyalty to his wife but also loyalty to himself, to the kind of man he wanted to be. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew that the balance of power in the household had begun to change. The night slowly came to an end, but the air in the mansion was no longer filled with the same kind of laughter it had started with. The guests rose from the table one after another, but their conversations were not about Madame Ifeoma's wealth or the Obiagelu family's status. Instead, they whispered about the young bride, the girl who had been humiliated, yet carried herself with quiet strength. Some shook their heads in disbelief at the cruelty they had witnessed, while others spoke with admiration about the grace with which Chidinma endured it. As the guests stepped out into the night, many of them glanced toward the servants' quarters, knowing that was where the true heart of the evening had been left. Some murmured to each other that a woman who could survive such humiliation with dignity would rise above it all one day. The echo of Chief Ikeen's rebuke still lingered in their minds, and none of them would forget how a simple village girl had shifted the pride of an entire household. When Chidinma finally walked back into the hall, she did not rush or bow her head. Her steps were steady, her back straight, her eyes calm. She looked like a woman who had been tested by fire and had come out stronger. The servants who had shared her pain earlier now smiled at her secretly, their faces glowing with respect. They knew she had turned her suffering into silent power. At the head of the table, Madame Ifeoma sat stiffly, her eyes lowered, her pride broken. For the first time, she realized that she had miscalculated. The daughter-in-law she thought she could crush had revealed a strength she could not control. And in that silence, the true victory belonged to Chidinma.